Again, thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'll turn you over to Michelle.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much. And thank you for joining us, everyone. Today, we will cover building a financial foundation. So, a guide to reserve funds and capital planning for community boards. To start things off, we thought it was helpful to remind everyone what the role of the board is. As we know, they are community volunteers. And the most common organization for us is Community Associations Institute, or CAI, which I'm sure is very familiar to those of you on the call. And they have a board member toolkit. So, great tips and tricks, things to know when you become a board member. And this is pulled right from that toolkit. And really, the role of the board is to protect and increase property value. This is accomplished by operating the association, maintaining the common property, and enforcing the governing documents. So that's a pretty bulky, pretty heavy sentence there, or responsibility for that board. And really, the area we're focused on with reserves is around the fiduciary duty. So, what does that mean? Well, really, without a reserve study, how is an association able to plan for properly maintaining the community? A reserve study will help you make informed decisions, act in the best interest of the association, and helps avoid conflicts of interest, right? So this is how reserves and reserve studies really will play into that fiduciary duty for the board. And when we say it's able to accomplish these things, how is that possible? What really is the purpose of a reserve study? Well, first and foremost, a reserve study is a budgeting tool. The goal is to help stabilize the budget and avoid surprises. How were we able to accomplish that? The goal really is to provide help with planning and prioritizing capital projects and serving as a community roadmap or strategic plan for maintaining the community's infrastructure. It really provides that 30-year roadmap for the association of all of their capital needs. So when we say capital needs, what are we referring to, right? Part of the board's role is determining really how to fund for maintaining the community. What does that mean? How do we maintain the community? It's really conducting all the capital repairs and capital projects that are necessary to help, remember, keep that property value either the same or increased, right? So part of doing that is maintaining all of the common area infrastructure. There's really three main ways to fund for these capital projects. There's reserve contributions, special assessments, and then bank loans, right? Obviously, funding capital projects through adequate reserves is the most practical, right? It's cost effective and a fair approach. Essentially, by funding the reserve account, owners are paying for their fair share. So if they're utilizing the private streets or maybe the elevators at a high rise or mid rise, or utilizing that great pool, they're paying for their use and the eventual replacement of those components. Now, special assessments, so that's okay, we've used this component all up and now we need to pay for the eventual replacement, is really passing that burden to future owners. So even if turnover or sale of units is relatively minimal, so there's, you're still paying for it. It's the same unit owners that's used those private streets or use that pool. It's still a very disruptive process, right? Difficult for homeowners to absorb a special assessment. They're used to fees being at X level, and now when they're faced with a $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 special assessment, it's really difficult to absorb, right? So when often faced with a special assessment, sometimes associations can't really fund that. And so it's common to make that cost or make that project a little more digestible by spreading out the payment of it via a loan. You need to do the project now. We need the funds right now. But to spread the cost out, we'll take out a loan, right? So it's a similar strategy to reserves where you're spreading it out. But instead of doing it through fair use and paying as you go, you're passing that burden on to future owners. And using that same analogies before, or situation where even if turnover is low and it's the same homeowners that utilize the streets and utilize the pool, if they're the ones paying for the loan, it does serve to spread it out, but it is costing them more money in the long run because now they're paying interest on that money as opposed to just building it into the dues and having the funds available when they need to. So what is the importance of reserves from the board's perspective, right? Well, first and foremost, as you mentioned, it fulfills that fiduciary duty, right? A study provides an independent third-party opinion on the most cost-effective way to maintain the community. It helps provide consistency and alignment by stabilizing the budget and really acting in good stewardship for their community. So what's the importance of reserves from the manager's perspective? Really, it helps avoid surprises and complaints, right? When you have a strategic plan in place, there's usually fewer surprises or fires to put out. Ideally, if you have time to plan, you can evaluate options ahead of time. So maybe it's on your radar that the clubhouse HVAC only has another 2 to 3 years left of useful life. Well, now you can start evaluating, does it make sense to add in some energy efficiencies, or do we want to consider an alternate option for these different components, right? So you can be proactive instead of reactive, where now you're scrambling and conducting emergency repairs or having to make these decisions kind of on the fly, right? So it provides that roadmap to help them really properly manage the community. And of course, compliance, right? We're seeing more and more states enact legislation and more eyes on reserves than ever before. It's not uncommon for us now to receive calls directly from homeowners that maybe have their unit listed, it's on the market, they get a potential buyer lined up, they have the contract executed, then all of a sudden in the 11th hour, the mortgage company for that prospective buyer says they need a copy of the reserve study, and this association's never had a reserve study. So it leaves the current owner scrambling, trying to come up with a reserve study to satisfy this buyer, right? It's becoming more and more commonplace for eyes to be on reserves and proper funding. Really, the market's getting more savvy, right? They're aware of the overall cost of ownership and maintenance, and everyone's doing what they feel they need to do really to protect their investment, right? Why does a mortgage company want to see the reserves? They want to ensure that this association is properly funding. They don't want to potentially issue a loan to a buyer if this association is in a lot of hot water, where they see a lot of special assessments, underfunding. It's a risk for them, right? Same with insurance. We hear insurance brokers and carriers are looking at reserves and reserve studies now to help understand their risk, right? They want their arms around this community. If you've deferred projects and don't have any money to do them, how likely are you to have a claim, right? So it's really, really important to make sure that you're aware of your needs, because others are going to be asking you the same before they invest in your community. So what's the importance of reserves from the individual owner? Well, really all of this really impacts the individual unit or homeowner, right? Having reserves will help protect their investment. It helps maintain eligibility for that mortgage financing, like the example I just discussed. It ideally will mitigate special assessments or unexpected financial surprises. By having the reserves in place, associations are more likely to conduct the necessary repairs, which of course will help preserve the community appearance and therefore help the resale value. By having the funds available, it does help to proactively maintain the community. And when you are proactively maintaining it, there's less of this deferred maintenance or accelerated costs because of the unwillingness to conduct repairs in a timely manner, which all of this will help provide safety and security for the owners, right? And really, at the end of the day, it's equity. It's fair equity, the fair way to operate, and will increase their equity in their units as well. So we now know the importance of reserves. What about the reserve study, right? So I wanted to start with CAI's reserve study standards. What is the definition for a reserve study? It's a budget planning tool, which identifies the components that a community association is responsible to maintain or replace. It identifies the current status of the reserve fund and provides a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the anticipated future major common area expenditures. I know that was really wordy and a lot of detail, but did want to provide that definition. Essentially, it's a physical evaluation to assess the community, right? It's going to cover a 30-year period. It provides a roadmap of expenditures. So, what are the needs of the community? And then, what is the supporting funding plan? How are we going to pay for it? Now, reserve studies will look differently. They need to satisfy those two things. What are our anticipated costs? How are we going to pay for it? But there's a lot of additional information that can come with that, right? So it really is important to compare sample reports when you're deciding. It's what does that service look like? And then what's the deliverable? How easy is it for me to read, understand, digest, and ultimately utilize, right? There aren't necessarily standards, or the standards don't necessarily take into account the condition assessment. So yes, you have to do it to help come up with replacement timing, but what is delivered to the client? Are photographs included? Is there a narrative for every component? What does the executive summary look like, right? So really important to make sure that you are reviewing sample reports. At the end of the day, does it provide all of the information you need in an easy, digestible manner, right? How easy and effective is it for you to utilize? So diving into those two core elements, really the expenditure plan and the funding plan, wanted to start here with the expenditure plan. So this is really the physical evaluation. So the reserve specialist or engineer will attempt to come to the community. Every reserve study will have an inventory, right? What are the components that the association's responsible for? And which ones do we classify as a reserve component, right? So these are things that we want to fund from the reserve account. And then every project will have an associated cost. Now, ideally, each expenditure plan will also provide you that quantification. So how many light fixtures, what's the linear feet of our sealants or the square footage of our balconies, right? So ideally, they'll give you that quantification. Ideally, they'll give you that useful life. So what is a normal expectancy for this type of roof or this type of pavement or our furnishings, right? When would we normally expect that to be done? And then it absolutely will include the timing. So based on the condition that was observed, when do we think we need to do it and what's it going to cost? It's very common to include inflation. So snapshot in time, how much do we anticipate the project to cost today? And then fast forward to when we're anticipating the project, what do we expect it to cost incorporating inflation? So this is the needs of the community. So based on that 30-year roadmap of needs, how are we going to pay for it, right? Or the funding plan. So there's three main funding strategies that are utilized to provide that supporting funding plan. Alternate funding methods can be incorporated. So that would be things like a special assessment or a loan. But to satisfy the reserve study standards, that can't be shown in a reserve study. As a best practice, we can't make a recommendation that you should plan on not funding reserves and anticipate a special assessment or loan or some sort of alternate funding. It has to be that you're going to fund to maintain your community adequately. So I wanted to cover those three different funding strategies with you. This is kind of the Goldilocks, right? So fully funded balance is the most expensive, which actually minimizes risk, right? Which would make sense. Cost more, less risk. Then there's the baseline funding, where it's the reverse, right? Most riskiest, cost less. And that we call kind of Goldilocks or the threshold funding, where it's kind of finding that balance for just right. And that's ultimately what Reserve Advisors recommends. We do include the threshold funding recommendation. Now, if you want to see the others, can we include them? Sure. But we prefer to show the one funding strategy, really help you understand what the best path forward is instead of providing all of these different options that can sometimes confuse things, especially when legislation requires you to fund the reserve account in accordance with the reserve study. We're seeing that more and more commonly introduced. Florida, Tennessee, Maryland, Jersey, lots of states are introducing requirements for funding reserves. So just as a quick summary here, as we mentioned, baseline funding would be the highest risk level, right? And therefore the lowest cost to fund. Full funding is the reverse, where it's the lowest risk level and therefore highest cost to fund. And then threshold is really that Goldilocks. So when we say that, what are the different numbers? Like how much are we talking here? Is it right in the middle, right? Is it 50%? Is threshold 50% of baseline and half of full funding? What variance are we talking about? So for that, we wanted to walk through an example showing those three funding scenarios. So same exact expenditure plan, same needs of the community, and then three supporting funding recommendations. I think this is a graph that we include in all of our executive summaries, and it truly is a graphical form of the funding plan. And what this graph depicts is that line is the reserve balance. The green bars are the reserve contributions, and the blue bars are the reserve expenditures. So assuming reserves don't exist, if you didn't have a reserve account, weren't funding reserves at all, the whole top half of the graph wouldn't exist, right? You'd have no money in reserves, you'd have no contributions. That means you'd essentially have these fluctuations in your budget every time there's expense, right? So whether that's a special assessment, or maybe you are taking out a loan and stabilizing that, and then you're essentially kind of like funding reserves now because you have an additional contribution. Really difficult for the average homeowner to plan, difficult for management, difficult for the board. So the goal of reserves, as we discussed, that let's pay our fair share, and you can see it's a stable, equitable contribution. It does inflate over time, but it's relatively stable. So where there are going to be years where you're contributing more than you're spending and you're growing that reserve account. And then there's going to be years where you're spending more than you're contributing and you're draining that reserve account. And that's perfect. That's ideal, right? We don't want reserves to be seen as these funds that are sitting away, tucked away for a potential disaster. That's not the case. It's money that's intended to be spent to maintain your community. So baseline funding, what that's doing is it's bringing that balance as we're driving down and finding that critical year, it's bringing your balance down to zero. And that's essentially what baseline means. Baseline is zero, right? So in this example, that funding scenario equates to annual funding of $49,000 per year, which equates to $132 per homeowner. So moving to threshold funding, again, same exact expenditures, but now we're putting a threshold in here. So we're not bringing that reserve balance right to zero. In the critical year, we're keeping a threshold or a cushion here. And I think it's important to explain the threshold a little bit. This is a question we'll get asked about. It's not a hard and fast rule where every community will have the same exact threshold. We will make a recommendation when we look at your overall expenditure plan, right? When we analyze your expenditure plan, what is the appropriate threshold for your association? There might be a couple years with a really lot of big expenditures, and maybe the threshold needs to go up a little bit. Or it might be relatively stable, and maybe we're able to go a little lower in the threshold. That really is customized. In this example, the threshold that was recommended was keeping reserves right over $100,000, which equated to $52,000 annually and 141 per unit owner. So essentially a $9 increase in annual owner contributions. Then lastly, we have the full funding method. So this is the one that's very conservative, very low risk, but as you can see, not very affordable, right? So this essentially says that you should be, full funding is 100% funded. So you can see the goal here was to end the reserve study with the association being 100% funded. And now this skyrockets the annual funding up to $79,000 annually, which equates to $213 per homeowner annually. So just as a reminder, when we put all three of these together, What does that mean? That pretty aggressive strategy where you're going right down to zero is $132 just for 7% more. So the increase from 132 to 141 brought that balance all the way up to where now they have a pretty comfortable cushion. And then the increase to fully fund reserves bumps that 141 all the way up to 213. So that's actually 61% more funding than the baseline funding. So that's why we really like this kind of Goldilocks approach, where it's finding that sweet spot to ensure that you have a cushion. There's some level of safety there, kind of a factor of safety, but not overfunding. We don't want all of this money sitting in the bank at any given time because we know there's never going to be the situation where everything fails at once, right? So we don't believe that you should have to have all of the funds available for every project at any given time. Now, if you ever have any questions about the funding strategy for your association, I encourage you to reach out to the engineer that prepared your reserve study. We're always happy to walk through what our recommendation was and why, and make sure that we're all aligned on the strategy. But what if reserves aren't enough? What if we knew we had this reserve study? This is how we should have funded reserves, but for one reason or another, the association didn't elect to increase at the levels requested in the reserve study. Well, now you're forced with, as we said, the options previously, either a special assessment through that loan or financing, or worst of all, doing nothing, which we know is absolute worst case scenario. Not only will that hurt property values, kind of erode condition, it will further deteriorate those components. So it will end up costing more money in the long run. So let's talk about each of those special assessments. What do we do if we need to conduct a special assessment? First and foremost, check your documents, right? Ensure that the board can levy an assessment without owner approval. And I think this goes without saying, make sure you're working very closely with management and your association attorney to ensure that you're in compliance with those documents. Know that there will be some administrative fees, some collection issues, and delinquent payments associated with those special assessments. That's just natural. Early communication is key. It's really important to make sure that you are communicating all these things in a timely manner to homeowners to ensure that they have time to financially prepare and mentally prepare, right, for the special assessment that's about to occur. One thing to remember about special assessments, these are good for unexpected expenses, right? It's a way to fund these projects when you weren't anticipating them, but know that this probably will be poorly received from the ownership, right? They might feel like the association wasn't properly planning. If you haven't been communicating to the association all along that the reserve fund isn't being funded adequately, right? That you're choosing to minimize that reserve fee, this might come as a surprise. They might assume that their dues are covering for full maintenance and capital repairs for their community. So it's important to make sure that everyone is aligned with the funding strategy that the association is choosing. And of course, if this becomes a pattern, repeat assessments can impact property values, right? It will be negatively viewed from potential buyers when they're doing their due diligence. So loans and financing. When we say that, this is typically made directly by the association, right? The association is taking out a loan on behalf of all of the owners to fund for these capital projects. So this would be if you're in a mid-rise building to replace the common area roof, or if you're an association with private streets to repave the streets, not a loan to replace your granite countertops in your kitchen, right? These are loans on the association's behalf for all of the common components. You can consider it a couple different ways. Sometimes it's a loan of credit where they're not quite sure what the project will need until you really kind of get under it. So it might be a loan of a credit, line of credit, and you want to consider those loan terms. Benefit of a loan is that it will provide faster access to funds compared to a special assessment, right? The bank can stroke a check much easier than a lot of homeowners can. So you can get these projects done in a timely manner. But know that that's going to cost more money in the long run, right? By having quick access to those funds, spreading it out over a period of time makes it easier for the homeowners, but it comes at a cost. So just quick numbers. You look at a $600,000 loan, a 7-year term, 5% interest rate, that equates to $712,000 plus fees. So an additional $112,000, right? Or over 20% more. And by the way, good luck at finding a 5% loan right now, right? I think we all know they're much higher than that. So this certainly comes at a cost. You'll want to consider the terms of the loan, right? What's the most digestible for your owners? Obviously, the shorter term loan, quicker you'll pay it off, less interest, but what's digestible and manageable for your owners? And then, of course, the bank is going to evaluate their risk too, right? So it's not a given that you're going to even qualify for a loan. The bank will look at delinquency rates, the lack of reserves or how much you have in reserves now, like how much can you actually pay for this project, or are you asking for the bank to pay it entirely? And owner occupancy rate, right? So there's a lot of different factors that the bank will take a look at before issuing a loan. So in summary, there's really not a one size fits all approach to funding. We understand that it is unique to each association's needs, right? The reserve study should be a starting point. Certainly that roadmap, budgetary tool for the association, then to analyze and decide what their funding strategy will be. And of course, subsequent updates will help provide a guide to a sustainable future. So CAI's best practice is to really update reserve studies every 3 years. A lot of state legislation is more around 5 years. I think Florida, I'm in Virginia, I think Florida is actually like 10 years. So different, it's important to take into account legislation, but CAI does recommend updating every 3 years just because there typically are so many moving pieces for associations. And then, of course, make sure you are utilizing your professionals as you're discussing strategies. What are other communities? What are your peers, your neighbors? What are they doing for their funding strategies? What is the community down the street doing? Work with your management company to understand the funding strategy that they would recommend. Work with your association bank, your association attorney, and of course, your reserve specialist, right? Utilize us all as a resource so that you can feel confident in your funding decisions.